Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I have very fond memories of Papua New Guinea. My very first job when I joined the Australian Public Service 30 years ago was to work on the Australia's aid program to Papua New Guinea. I was lucky enough to visit 14 provinces. It's a wonderful country. I still love it. I was lucky enough then to go back later when I was Australia's representative at APEC in the lead up to Papua New Guinea's host year in 2018. So really delighted to be here. A little like Michael, I'm going to talk to Australia's experience with regulating foreign investment as Papua New Guinea thinks about its own regulatory and policy settings, and obviously happy to talk during the Q&A about sort of any reflections on what this might mean for PNG, but I will focus on Australia's experience. So I'm going to talk about our job as the regulator. I'm going to talk about how our job's changed over recent years, particularly in response to growing national security threats. I'll talk about how we do our job and some recent reforms to our framework. So basically, we've got one job as the regulator, and that is to facilitate the investment that Australia needs to grow our economy while protecting our national security and national interest. So as Michael made clear, Australia's economy has long relied on foreign investment. It's very important for our growth. We need foreign investment to continue to grow our economy. And we welcome foreign investment. Our standard practice is to enable that foreign investment to flow unless we face a national security or national interest issue. So the default is the investment comes in, but investments over a certain threshold require screening prior approval through our regulatory framework. So our job as the regulator is to look after policy settings, and a piece of legislation, I'll talk about it in a moment, sets out our legislative framework. We look at about 1,500 cases a year and screen those against national interest and national security test. And those cases combined are worth about $186 billion a year, last year. And then we also do a compliance function. So we just make sure that investors who require approval are getting that approval, and also that any conditions that are imposed on those investments are complied with. So that's our job. The Treasurer is our decision maker. We advise the Treasurer on those cases and our policy settings, and we also rely on support from the Foreign Investment Review Board, which is a part-time advisory board, but it is made up of some very eminent business leaders and other people with extensive experience in foreign investment that enables us to inform the Treasurer in a very evidence-based way. So our job has existed for 50 years. 1975 was a very big year for Papua New Guinea. It was also a big year for the Australian foreign investment regime. That's when our Act, the Foreign Acquisitions and Takeovers Act, passed the Australian Parliament. And the origin of our Act was that a foreign company was trying to take over an Australian fast food company that made the Chico roll. I don't know if anyone's had the misfortune of eating a Chico roll, but that was the big instigator of an Australian foreign investment regime. And probably for the first 30 or 35 years of our regime, most of our focus was on national interest, mainly through a political lens as to whether or not foreign investment would gain the social licence it needs within Australia to meet the pub test in the Australian environment. But recently, probably in the last 15 years, the focus has been much more on national security risks. And that's really in response to the changing geostrategic environment that we sort of face, that you'll see on the front page of the papers every day, but also in response to growing changes in technology that really raise a set of risks that didn't previously exist around foreign investment. So in terms of sort of how our Act has changed, we had legislation in 2015 that basically introduced a national security test into our Act for the first time. In 2021, there were a series of amendments to the Act that strengthened the Treasurer's powers to act against national security risk in certain circumstances. And we also gained a series of powers as the Treasury that enable us to enforce our compliance with our Act. So in terms of what some of those growing national security threats are, they really relate to the ability for owners of assets to cause harm to Australia's national interest or national security through the access that they can gain to physical sites, through the access they can gain to information such as cybersecurity plans, through the ability to exert strategic control over key assets, through their ownership of those assets, and the influence they can exert through that ownership to affect global supply chains or Australian supply chains. So those risks are growing, and that makes our job as the regulator more difficult. At the same time, we continue to need to attract the investment that Australia needs to grow, so we're sort of constantly trying to balance our framework through a risk-based approach. So in terms of how we go about doing that job, we're very much focused in working with agencies right across the Australian government. So it's not just about the Treasury and the team that I lead and the Foreign Investment Review Board. We're very much involved in seeking views from all of the state and territory governments, but also from right across the Commonwealth government. So we deal with 28 separate arms of the Australian government. All of the national security agencies are involved in our assessments, as are all the economic departments. And on the really complex cases, we get all those agencies around one table and talk through the balance, basically, of national security risk and economic benefit, and how we make judgment calls about whether or not we should enable an investment into Australia. As I mentioned before, we do have a compliance function. We now go out and visit sites to make sure any compliance with conditions that we're imposing on our investments are met. We've also passed recently a set of reforms to our Act that really are designed to streamline low-risk investment, to strengthen our assessment of high-risk investments, and to be more transparent with investors about our settings. So we've got a 16-page policy document that sets out in quite a degree of detail how we think about going about our risk-based assessments. And so when we think about risk, we think about who is investing, what are they investing in, and how are they structuring a transaction. So in terms of the who, if it's an investor we're familiar with, they're trusted, they're well known, it's much lower risk. If it's a brand new investor, we don't know much about them, we've got to do quite a bit of digging to find out exactly who is involved in their governance structures, who are the ultimate owners of this company who want to invest in Australia, what scope is there for others to influence their operations. In terms of the what, we're very focused on the really sensitive core assets that matter to Australia's national security. So our critical infrastructure, obviously a very big focus, whether it's the electricity grid or our ports or those sort of core assets, telecommunications networks, obviously. We're also very focused on critical technology, so high-end tech, quantum computing, those sort of issues get a lot of focus, as do anything that's involved with major data. So whether that's data of Australians for medical testing or whatever it is, anything that involves those sensitivities gets much closer scrutiny. And we also care about how a transaction is structured in terms of whether there's scope to manipulate that structure to sort of cause harm to Australia's interests. So as we go about doing that job, as I mentioned, we consult very broadly across government. We also think about how our Act, the Foreign Acquisitions and Takeovers Act, intersects with other regulatory frameworks across government. So we've got our Department of Home Affairs have a Security of Critical Infrastructure Act. We think about how our Act intersects with theirs. We've also obviously got the Defence Act to protect our national sort of core defence assets. So that's sort of how our job's changed, how it's evolved over recent years, and happy to go into more during Q&A if that would be useful in terms of how that might play out in other countries. Thank you.